the way I work with clay, I try and think of it as like sort of drawing, and I use coils mostly, and the coils I use are kind of extruded bits of clay. I think clay is really just a very seductive material. Every like ceramicist or potter that I know ends up really obsessed with the material. Maybe it's a bit of a cliche to say, but it's the most transformative material that you can work with. It's like liquid into mud, into any shape you want it to be, and then it's permanent. I've had the studio since 2021. Before that was based in Islington Mill in Salford. And then since moving here and since spending, massive amounts of time outside in the hills, in the woods, in the bog, the countrysides definitely have an influence on what I do.
Welcome.
I've been working on a series of soundtracks based on feminist science fiction stories, which started out as soundtracks for novels. This kind of idea of experiencing time really differently. The protagonist, she's like really out of step, really out of time, and really experiences things at these different paces and rhythms. Found that story, The Sleep of Plants, in 2020, in lockdown, in Old Trafford, in a small sort of urban space. There's ceramics that have been around for like 20,000 years. Knowing that I'm working within this sort of ancient history, working with the same mud from the same ground, it's like time travelling in a way. I think there's really something quite magical about clay.
I was into clothes making and clothes pattern cutting beforehand, and then I kind of accidentally started experimenting with some ceramics, but using the same methods, so making flat patterns that I would cut out of slabs of clay rather than cloth. It kind of felt like a quite natural way of progressing into a new medium that made sense to me, and also tied into new histories, because there's also history of frieze making in ceramics as well. It's exploring the different like textural qualities of clay and the different materials it can mimic. So it's quite directed by the limitations of the medium, but it also creates its own aesthetic through those limitations. So it started out with a kind of ongoing interest that I have in mannequins and models of the human body, particularly because they cross these two worlds that I'm interested in, both fashion on the one hand and anatomy and medicine on the other. Usually I just have an idea, or there's a reference image that I'm using as the starting point. Then I can choose which bits to add texture to. It's often in the kind of textile qualities of the clothing that the figures are wearing, or with some of the works in the show, the peeling away parts of the cast, which have almost like merged with the body, so they have a sort of fleshy interior.
I've been in this studio for 4 years. I made the move back to my home during lockdown. I've been making ceramics for 15 years now. Some of the imagery I was making led me to ceramics because I wanted to make them in 3D form, and I wanted them to look like a marble bust, giving these imaginary characters that I was drawing, like making a portrait of them, kind of immortalizing them and giving them a bit more authority and presence. I find it's quite intuitive. Like the first time I had to go at it, I found that I could make what I wanted to make. My interest in perfume bottles comes from, I guess, their predecessor, which is snuff bottles. They have very similar design elements, and I've heard quite a few perfume makers and designers talk about how they were inspired by snuff bottles. I also started to see connections between the actual substance of the snuff bottles. Snuff or powdered tobacco was also a ingredient in many fragrances, and there are also perfume brands as well.